country. And it was very, very very kind to them in the end. Again, maybe people still forget exactly what happened, but I remember I was there. I was there every single day. And I remember that trifecta. And I remember that bilateral support that we had from both parties, that we didn't really care whether they existed or not. Again, we were in full force. And so realizing that these additional tools were needed to address a rapidly deteriorating situation, and knowing that we had to implement the Troubled Assets Program, which passed, by the way, with bipartisan support from Congress, we knew that that was the first step that we needed to take. But I want to make it clear that even when President Obama took office in January 2009, I already mentioned the jobs that were lost, I already mentioned the GDP that contracted. But there were many things that were still happening at that moment in time, and we knew we were not out of the woods. The nation's credit markets were still basically frozen. Bank lending was almost non-existent. The market for municipal debt was in deep disrepair, leaving states and localities cash-strapped. Housing prices were still continuing to plunge, setting off a wave of foreclosures. Pushed by panic, the economy contracted at its fastest pace in more than 50 years. Major financial institutions remained unstable, losses by financial firms were mounting, doubts about government's ability to stop the panic and protect the financial system were growing. The house was literally on fire. And we knew that putting out the fires of this crisis was not going to be enough. To address the underlying causes of the crisis, we had to modernize our regulatory framework, put powerful consumer financial protections in place. So we knew that a new strategy had to be developed for this new financial stability plan. And it also took into account a mantle of financial reform that was being proposed and championed and enacted within the Dodd-Frank Act of 2012. And so those financial reforms were very important because, of course, they laid the groundwork on how to move forward so that we would not revisit what we experienced in terms of the falling credit markets that were frozen in financial institutions that put the entire global economy at risk. That same legislation also enacted the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, so we knew that a dedicated consumer watchdog was now in place as well. And when I look back, just for fun, as I do every so often, I look back at the timeline of what happened between September 7th, actually, when Fannie and Freddie were placed in government conservatorship. Very, very scary time. And then, a series of actions. September 16th, the Fed announced the $85 billion loan to AIG. September 19th, the SEC temporarily banned short selling of financial companies. September 19th, the Fed creates a liquidity facility called AMLF, Treasury guarantees, money market mutual funds. The list goes on. Very, very specific, very, very decisive. And, actually, every once in a while, believe it or not, I actually carry these timelines with me in my phone every so often to remind me just how decisive and deliberate those actions were at a very, very, very challenging time. And I'm reminding all of you today because, again, I think it's important as we set the context for this conversation, what had to happen, not just at a domestic level, but at a global level, in partnership with other central banks, in partnership with other ministers of finance, to make sure that we can think about the best practices, what was happening around the world, and how we needed to respond to that. And so even when I think about after the president took office, even as late as January 16th, 2009, the Treasury, the Fed, and the FDIC announced capital guarantee and liquidity packages for one of our largest banks, Bank of America. And so we had to, again, even continue this moving forward to make the financial system safer, stronger, and more resilient than it was beforehand. And we are still, by the way, living with the broad economic consequences, and there's still a very interesting road ahead. This isn't a moment in time. This is all cumulative, and it compounds if it's not addressed at that moment. And so, again, my slides aren't advancing, so I'm just gonna do what I need to do to move forward with my script. You can advance it manually. There it is. Great. So again, just a reminder of the quotes. This is kind of the highlights of the media quotes that I came across about what it could have been. And again, a reminder to this comprehensive and bipartisan, or I'd say nonpartisan, approach to what we need to do, and even today, what we need to do. And so I would say the takeaways from that financial crisis, again, consumer behavior is the hardest to change. Unless there's a shock to the system, welcome to our new shock, which I will get into in a minute with the global pandemic. The fundamentals of the job market have absolutely evolved, and I will talk about that a little bit more as we think about this pandemic. And unfortunately, the shift in demographics will influence economic and social behaviors. And these shifts in demographics are changing at the economic, political, and social level. Some good, some not so good. So welcome to the great pandemic, the new economic, political, and social disruptor. Again, no playbook. There is no playbook here. And regardless of who would have been in office when this pandemic started, regardless, there was a time frame in place. We all remember March of 2020. There was going to be a dedicated effort by the private sector in partnership with the federal government for approvals to get this vaccine underway. The timeline at that time was the same, which is get the vaccine completed so that in January of 2021, the vaccine would begin distribution. No matter who was in office, that was the plan, regardless. And at that time, the plan was a 6-month distribution process for the vaccine, and then hopefully, no matter who was in office, the summer of 2021, we could move forward with a lot of the other priorities of whoever was in the administration. So what happened? There are things that will always be out of our control, no matter who's in office. And the global pandemic has certainly reminded us that that is the case. And obviously part of our challenge is inconsistent strategies, uncertainty on where this will all go, when this will end, what other variants will there be, and a total rethinking about labor. Who would have thought that what's happening to our employment base, the great resignation, would actually happen? And again, these are very, very scary times because the shock to the system has changed so much. Now, for our economy in the US, it's about 70% of our GDP is consumer spending. So it's interesting because the fundamentals of our equity markets are actually okay. They're actually okay. But obviously, no one would have really foreseen kind of the supply and demand that has really complicated our efforts with our supply chain, with consumer demand still continuing, and in what ways. And in many ways, thankfully, technology has enabled a lot of these demands to be fulfilled through e-commerce, etc. But again, these situations are very, very unusual. And knowing that this isn't just the US, knowing that this is something that is impacting all of us, and let us not forget, this is not just an economic impact. Lives, real lives, have been lost. I'm sure everyone knows someone who has been impacted, has lost a life, lost a loved one, or whose medical conditions have been compromised. It's very, very unfortunate that we have this whole other layer that we need to deal with. And again, this is the human side of it. This is what I am referring to as the third dimension. But I want to share with you, and maybe you've seen this, I want to focus on what the World Bank is thinking about in terms of their economic outlook. And it's really, I love how they kind of summarize this in 5 slides. And so just again, to level set how the World Bank thinks about their perspective kind of path forward. We know that global growth is expected to decelerate tremendously in 2022 from about 5.5% to 4.1%. Again, this is according to the World Bank. This reflects the continued disruption caused by COVID-19, as well as supply bottlenecks. Now, you can see in this slide, global growth is projected to decelerate in 2023. Based on this, global growth is set to slow sharply as the initial rebound in consumption and investment fades, and macroeconomic support is withdrawn. Much of the global slowdown over the forecast horizon is accounted for by major economies, which will also weigh on demand in emerging market and developing countries, what I refer to as EMDEs. This slide here, EMDEs are projected to experience a weaker recovery than advanced economies. While that sounds like it might be obvious, again, this is where hopefully we as a collective voice can make a difference. In contrast to advanced economies, most EMDEs are expected to suffer substantial scarring to output from the pandemic, with growth trajectories not strong enough to return investment or output to pre-pandemic trends over the forecast horizon of 22 and 23. After surprising to the upside in 2021, global inflation is expected to remain elevated this year. That was a very big surprise for many, many people in terms of how this kind of ran away. The rebound in global activity, together with supply disruptions and higher food and energy prices, have pushed up headline inflation across many countries. More than half of inflation targeting EMDEs experienced above target inflation in 21, prompting central banks to increase policy rates. Consensus forecasts anticipate median global inflation to remain elevated in 2022. Severe economic disruptions driven by the rapid and simultaneous spreading of the Omicron variant are a key downside to risk to near-term growth. The slowdown in global growth from 21 to 22 could be sharper if the fast spread of Omicron overwhelms health systems and prompts a reimposition of strict pandemic control measures in major economies. Omicron-driven economic disruptions could reduce global growth further this year, anywhere from 0.2 to 0.7 percentage points, depending on the underlying assumptions. The associated dislocations could also aggravate supply bottlenecks and exacerbate inflationary pressures. And finally, global cooperation and effective national policy will be needed to address the severe costs associated with weather and climate disasters. Severe natural disasters and climate-related events could also derail the recovery in EMDEs. So global cooperation is needed to accelerate progress toward meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement on climate change and reduce the economic, health, and social costs of climate change. The international community can also help by scaling up climate change adaptation. I would say on our next steps, these are my next steps, by the way, I want to make that clear. We need to think about solutions beyond our borders. The one thing that I have learned more than anything, I mentioned this story last night. I have an uncle who is a Catholic missionary, and he is from Mexico and has worked in so many countries, so many continents. But of all the work that he's done, he's 81 years old, still working, by the way, in Haiti as we speak. But of all the experiences that he's had, he has said that Africa remains his favorite place, and that when should he pass in the future, he wants to rest in Africa. We've talked about this a lot. He actually shared this not that long ago. I asked him, what was it? He talks about this all the time, about going back to Africa. What was it? And he says the same thing every time. It's the people. The people make a difference. There is something incredible about the human spirit here. It's not just about survival, it's about thriving. It's about getting beyond yourself and understanding that the collective is more important than the one. And so as we think about, yes, absolutely. As we think about kind of, this uncertainty that exists for whatever our new normal is going to be, as we think about the monetary and fiscal levers for rebalancing that we're going to need, as we think about targeting the inequality that this pandemic has caused, what we need to do to jumpstart job creation, what we need to do to think about patience for these geopolitical tensions that continue to rise. That human capital, that is my final piece here. Human capital remains the best investment that we can make. So absolutely. So as we think about the global economy, that is now at this very, very interesting crossroad, policymakers' most important task is to provide emergency relief to the hardest hit individuals and the economic sectors. Although the worst may have passed, maybe, the insecurity and uncertainty that will remain for some time. We are not out of the woods yet. But here we have an enormous opportunity for Liberia. So why am I here? I am here for many reasons, but one of the opportunities that I see here is I am an executive committee member of a congressional commission called America 250. I was appointed by Congress to lead the efforts for the United States to start planning our own commemoration of our 250th anniversary in 2026, less than 5 years away. So when I learned of this amazing milestone here in Liberia, of your own bicentennial, the celebration of free Black Americans in Liberia, it just reminds us all that Black history is American history. Liberia's history is American history. My goal is to go back and tell the story of Liberia, write about the story of Liberia, how you are commemorating this once-in-a-lifetime milestone, and how this could be the beginning, perhaps, of a conversation that we've never had in the United States about what history really means. It's not just the American Revolution in 1776. We are a nation of nations. My family is from Mexico, which, by the way, I live in California. California was Mexico. So my family didn't cross the border crossed us. And I see that here. I see the same spirit as my family. I see those same values of family, food, and faith here in Liberia. It is alive and well. And I will do everything I can to support what you're doing. What I said, my commitment to Dr. Nelson is I want to make an effort. Even though you have free tuition here, which is so amazing, you are investing in the future, in these future leaders. I want to help. I want to do my own personal initiative to help support those students who perhaps won't be able to pay for their own books or their own registration. I promise you, I will make a personal commitment to do what I can to help the students here, help the country here, and be part of such a wonderful, wonderful milestone as your 200. And I look forward to participating in this next panel and hearing more what we can do as a collective, not as the one, but as a collective voice. Thank you.
Wow, a splendid and wonderful presentation. Let us give our speaker a big hand of applause. Before we go to our panelists, we take a quick takeaway from her presentations. First, presented on the financial crisis in the United States, and the quick takeaways that we can get from that was during that transition, as a first woman that was confirmed, and a woman of color that was confirmed by the Senate, though maybe it could be seen as something, okay, I'm the first woman, but she didn't see it that much, because she see a collective effort, where maybe other women could have been on board to support her effort. But by and large, she did not relent. She went ahead. When the call was made,